you very much everyone for coming. Today we're joined by Jakob Holtermann from Copenhagen, and he's going to talk to us about Alf Ross and Herbert Hart and legal realism. So,
thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming, and thank you very much to the organizers, and particularly you, Hafsteinn, for contacting me. Early fall of 18, we agreed finally. Now I'm here. I'm going to talk a bit about the forthcoming publication of Alf Ross's main work on law and justice, which is forthcoming in a new translation, English translation, a full translation. I'm going to say a bit more about that, but before I start, I thought I might give a bit of context, because we're just talking that to some degree he's clearly not the main character on your syllabi here or anything. So a bit of context, where is he coming from, and why perhaps am I interested in him today. And one of the things that's very high on the agenda where in the environment where I'm working in Copenhagen is what is sometimes referred to as an ongoing empirical term in law more generally. You see a lot of work being done that includes sociological angles, political science, quantitative work, relying somehow on big data and network citation, network analysis, linguists working on law, anthropologists, etc., etc. All of this is an interesting phenomenon in itself. Sometimes it's character of a term may be exaggerated, and there are certainly large parts of the legal academy that survives almost in ignorance of this development. But still, it's a real phenomenon. And one of the big questions that I keep bumping into, having colleagues who work on this, and where we have these deep sort of Methodenstreit battles over scientific approaches to law, is what on earth, why do we have these empirical disciplines making inroads into law, claiming some part of the legal field as their domain? And the question is, what are we to make of this? They seem to gather a lot of empirical facts, often quantitatively, about law. And is it about as uninteresting as the picture I have here, the city sign of Snowmass Village, which lists a number of numbers, established in 1967, elevation 8,000 something, population 1,800, that totals around 12,000. So that's something we can do. We can add numbers and get information, but does it really tell us anything interesting? And specifically in relation to law, I very often see colleagues working on law who challenge the significance, much along the lines of what Kevin Armstrong is saying here in a rather old quote from 1998, where he was commenting on the huge pile of work being done by primarily political scientists on the European Court of Justice. And he asks, somewhat polemically, he says, political science may have discovered the European Court of Justice, but has it discovered law? So the claim is the empirical approaches here, i.e. Political science, cannot really tell us anything about law. We still have a domain that is the primary field of traditional doctrinal law, and where the empirical scholars cannot really enter. They can talk all they want about something else, something adjacent to it. And I think Alf Ross's interest, it points to the fact that a lot of the empirical work seems to be somewhat reductionist, to miss out on what is specific about law, to reduce law to something else. And the reason why I find Ross interesting very broadly, generally, is that I think he provides the most helpful way I've bumped into of conceptualizing law, and especially what makes law, its normative character, the field as a field that deals with validity, in a way that makes it an empirical object without reducing it to something that's definitely not law, like to a court rather than a law like Armstrong is lamenting here. So I find primarily this articulated in his main work on Law and Justice, on Ret og Retfærdighed in Danish from 1953 originally. It was translated in 1958 to English in a very poor translation, and it's significantly abbreviated and also has some quite unfortunate made some quite unfortunate translational choices that has significantly distorted his key message. And so I'm going to try to say what is really his main points in this talk. I see him, as I said, as a proponent, an early proponent of the empirical term in legal scholarship. And it starts from a concern that is characteristic of him, of his Leicester early main inspiration, Hans Kelsen, not so much of H.L.A. Hart, for instance, is the deep concern, which is epistemological, is a concern whether or not we can consider law as being a science in the Germanic sense of the word, that is not as a natural science, but as a Wissenschaft, something that deserves its place in the academy and to be studied there. From Ross's point of view, his approach to this challenge is characteristic in two ways compared to Kelsen. First, he considers this to be a specific case of the general main problem in philosophy of science for decades, centuries. What is science? How do we identify what science is as compared to non-science, and in particular compared to pseudoscience, that is that which presents itself as being scientific yet is not. And that's the well known as the demarcation problem in philosophy of science, and Ross is addressing the main challenge for legal philosophy is a special case of that challenge in philosophy of law, that is seeing it as a specific case of this demarcation problem. Furthermore, he's systematic in his approach to this challenge in the sense that he approaches it from a general theory of what constitutes science. He does not think that, okay, we need to find some ad hoc exceptionalist explanation why law specifically can be a science, realizing that it seems to be different from other kinds of other sciences, saying, okay, we need some ad hoc exceptional explanation or justification for this field. He says we can only approach this relying on buying into a generic understanding of what science is, and law has to either meet that generic understanding of what counts as science, or it will fail. And specifically in case, what Ross does is, especially when he writes on Law and Justice, the generic theory of what science is, which he subscribes to, is that provided by the Vienna Circle, logical positivism, logical empiricism. The main tenets defining what counts as a science are provided from the ideas developed in logical positivism. And from this approach, it seems that the two traditional candidates, you probably remember the Tony Honoré quote where he says that every year in philosophy of law, jurisprudence, the legal positivists and the natural lawyers are fighting over the World Cup, and the sociologists and realists, they never learn the rules. So we have these traditional two contenders. Ross quite quickly dismisses both of these. His critique is perhaps most well known and accounts also for possibly his rather a different topic. I'll skip that. His critique of natural law is probably most well known. He calls it also material idealism, and the main idea here is that he says that fundamentally natural law has to rely on some foundational idea of justice. The way he construes it, he's sort of his approach generally in epistemology is that he's a foundationalist. He thinks that if we are going to be able to justify some kind of scientific discipline, it has to be done in such a way that we can derive any statement made within that discipline from some indubitable foundation. And he says that if we're natural lawyers, that indubitable foundation is somehow provided by a fundamental idea of justice, providing substantive criteria for what counts as and ultimately we can always determine whether an assertion made in law, if it's scientific, then we can verify it by deriving it from these foundations that are provided by this idea of justice. And Ross, in one of his most influential passages, says that the problem with this approach is that, and not exactly politically correct, he says that natural law is like a harlot at the disposal of everyone. And what he means by saying this is that fundamentally, if we rely on an idea of justice, then the problem with an idea of justice is that they are built on private intra-subjective intuitions. And as he says, cannot my intuition be just as good as yours? So if we're seeking for solid foundations for science, that will never do. Interestingly, and what is sometimes overlooked, because sometimes Alf Ross is read as if he were a legal positivist, which he is not. He's a logical positivist, but not a legal positivist. These are two very different philosophical traditions. Ross is equally skeptical, even though he's more amiable or not as belligerent towards legal positivism. The problem, he says, with legal positivism, and his primary target is Hans Kelsen, is that he says that the foundation there, the Grundnorm, if we're not to pick that completely arbitrarily, then it has to be somehow derived from, regardless how much Kelsen denies that he makes any inference from the efficaciousness of the basic norm to its validity. Ross says if we were to convince ourselves that we are justifiably picking that basic norm instead of any other basic norm on the basis of which we derive any statement made in law, then we are making making the naturalistic fallacy. So he dismisses also legal positivism, and that sort of then presents the challenge for legal philosophy at its most clear and extreme way, because then sort of the two traditional contenders are out of the picture, and he develops what generally falls in place within the broad tradition, which was traditionally sort of sprung out in parallel in the US and in Scandinavia, the American legal realism and Scandinavian legal realism as two parallel traditions that emphasize primarily that legal science, legal scholarship has to rely on the key notions being something to do with behavior, and propositions made in legal science have to be some kind of predictions. These are sort of the key notions, and the question is, can we develop a full theory of law that is satisfactory on these grounds? And the challenges that this general approach meets are, I'll go through them through the lens which Hart provides us with, because I imagine in this context in particular, of course, his general critique of legal realism is well known, and also he's very concretely been very influential in perhaps sealing the fate of Alf Ross in the English language areas, in the sense that he's most often portrayed as included in the curricula as sort of, because perhaps we need another occasion of telling how brilliant a philosopher Hart was in not committing the errors of this philosopher alongside all the others who he put in their place. I think Hart was wrong, and I'll try to unfold this, but I'll structure it around two main challenges that we can find in Hart's work, which he launches against Ross and against other legal realists. the first main challenge, and perhaps the most well known, is that there is something about this empirical approach which emphasizes behavior and predictions about behavior in law, which fails to capture a central aspect of what constitutes law. And I know this is all well known for you, but I'll go through it and rehearse it because much relies on getting this right to see the differences and how exactly the subtleties and the ways in which this is already incorporated in Ross's theory. Hart's objection starts from the observation that if we have two kinds of group behavior, one which is governed by habit and one which is governed by rule, if we are only looking at them qua behavioral phenomena, as something that are as phenomena that exhibits behavior, social behavior, then they are empirically indistinguishable. We see patterns of regularity. We see if certain things occur, then certain patterns of behavior seem to follow. And in that sense, we cannot see any distinctness about the rule-governed phenomenon compared to the habit-based phenomenon. However, we all seem to agree intuitively, and that's why it's an argument against this, that misses out something important, because there is, regardless of the lack of any behavioral difference, there is a qua-social phenomena, there is a key difference between the two. And Hart has this famous example of comparing people who go to church, where we say when people go to church, when you enter a church, there is a rule that you should take off your hat when you enter the church. However, the next day, if you all the same inhabitants of the same little village, or the day before, rather, it used to be Friday nights or Saturday nights you go to the cinema, and on Sundays you go to church. When you go to cinema, there is no rule making it obligatory that you have to go to the cinema. You do that as a habit, or because you want to, or whatever. So these two phenomena are different, and Hart claims that they differ not in virtue of behavior, but rather in virtue of the internal aspect, primarily characterized by the critical reflective attitude. That's his key claim, that's what distinguishes the two fields. And his claim then is that Ross and all the other empiricists, all the behaviorists, they fail in their approach to law because they fail to single out that specific difference that takes this social phenomenon apart from other social phenomena that are habit-based. They fail to account for this internal aspect, so they don't see this difference. And in particular, they dispense with what is characteristic of those who observe this internal aspect, who adopt the internal point of view, is that they apply ought propositions, to use a term from Kelsen, which Hart, at least later on, gradually got to acknowledge and embrace as fitting once he said, oh, now I finally get what Kelsen meant. Okay, let's focus on that objection first. Ross has a reply to this, and he has a reply. My claim is generally that this distinction between the external aspect, the regularity of behavior, and the internal aspect, primarily constituted by the critical reflective attitude, this distinction is already present, and Ross has already considered that distinction and taken it into account in his theory. The most characteristically, or the place where he develops this distinction is he asks us to imagine, to sort of visualize the challenge meeting the empiricist who wants to understand law as an empirical phenomenon, and how can we have a scientific study of this, going back to his original purpose. He asked us to imagine that we're observing chess, we have no clue what it is, and then we're just observing what happens. And then he says, if we're just observing from the outside, we will never really understand what it is that we're observing. We're just observing a number of regularities, people moving pieces about on a chessboard. We have no clue really what, we cannot establish which rules govern this game of chess. And here, so very clearly Ross considers and explicitly dismisses the behaviorist approach, which at least some has said that Hart ascribed to him and pointed out the insufficiency of. He says that no matter how many times I've watched a game of chess, I can believe that I can falsely think and infer from their behavior that there could be some rule prohibiting opening with the pawn on a2, for instance. So he says, in response to this, we have to invoke an introspective method. We cannot but apply some kind of introspective method, proceed on the hypothesis that these people are doing what they're doing because they subscribe to and play in accordance with a certain number of rules which make certain movements of the pieces on the chessboard in accordance with the rules and so on. So he very clearly says that we have to adopt an introspective method. He's not, in that sense, a die-hard behaviorist, regardless of the criticism. Okay, then we're returning to Hart because he sort of develops this argument, his critique. It was originally primarily articulated in his review of On Law and Justice, by the way, I should say this, in 1959 in Cambridge Law Review. He reviewed On Law and Justice Hart in an article which was called Scandinavian Realism, and it was a review specifically of Ross, but it sort of has unfairly also sort of targeted, come to imply an attack on the entire group of Scandinavian realists. But he unfolds it there, and he further unfolds it, although it's less clear whom he's criticizing in the concept of law there. He's sometimes taken to criticize also in some of those passages American legal realists, Austin, several others. If we focus specifically on his critique of Ross, his second argument is one which we could say the problem is, okay, if we say that there is this distinction in Ross's work between what we can observe in terms of outward behavior and then what we can hypothesize about when we adopt an introspective method. If we accept this arguendo, then we can first say we can launch two challenges to this. First, we can ask, how is introspection empirical? If you say by your own standards you're a logical empiricist or logical positivist who claims that for something to count as a science, it has to be verifiable, empirically verifiable. How can we empirically verify whatever someone believes to be the case? How can we introspect into what rules certain actors in a game or actors in the legal field feel obligated to follow? How can we gain access to this? And secondly, he objects to Ross's analysis once he adopts this introspective method, saying that Ross is just saying, well, the introspective that aspect of law which we gain access to through introspection is merely just one big blur of feelings. It's just a matter of people feeling some kinds of obligations, and he says that it's not just a matter of mere feelings. That's his other second objection. That's one aspect of his second objection. The other is, again, saying that he accuses Ross of somehow dispensing with all propositions. So, and then he reasserts in response to Ross that we should instead rely on, and without the logical positivist or logical empiricist, without relying on their central tenets, we can we have no problem subscribing to the accounting for, taking into account the critical reflective attitude as a real phenomenon that holds the key, according to Hart, to the internal aspects, distinctive normative vocabulary. Okay, my claim is that Ross has also a reply to these objections, and I'll just present the main points that are contained in his response, and then I'll explain what he means by these points. And the key move, which is essential and which was what Hart apparently failed to appreciate in Ross's work, is what I call his egg of Columbus. That is sort of the surprising, slightly tinkering with the premises of the epistemological challenge for the philosophy of legal science, which, like Columbus, he's trying to balance an egg on a flat surface, and then he solves the riddle by crashing the egg so it has a flat bottom and then it can stand. And Ross does a little bit of the same. He crashes legal science, but saves something we can call legal science, which still manages to stand on a surface. How the key notions are the following. He moves the statements of legal science, of doctrinal study of law, from being norm expressive to being norm descriptive, from being in norms to being about norms. He introduces propositional attitude contexts and around the norms, and he creates the set phrase that a certain directive is valid. Here I should write scientifically valid, because it's the specific, there is a distinction in Danish between two kinds of legal validity called gyldig and gældende. And I chose to translate it in the forthcoming translation with scientifically valid to emphasize that it's a kind of explicative definition he provides specifically for what should we understand. So he's not unlike Hart, who's trying to describe how people generally use a word like legal validity. Ross is saying, how should we use the word legal validity in legal science for it to actually become a science? And that's why I call it scientifically valid. We can get back to this in the discussion, I guess. But the explanation here.
What do you call the other?
Just valid.
Okay.
So yeah, thanks for. So there's a distinction which is important in Ross's work between what we in the translation then call valid and scientifically valid. And that distinction is blurred in the old translation. There it's all just called valid. So you cannot follow when Ross is talking about one and when he's talking about the other. And part of Hart's objection, which I'll get back to, is that, but this cannot be its meaning in the mouth of a judge, famously. And that's true because he's talking about scientific validity, not about ordinary validity or judicial validity. But I'll try to explain what this means, moving from norm expressive to norm descriptive in Ross's work. And I use, and I apologize for this, a very simplistic analogy to explain this to my students. I found that it works, and I found also very often that very sophisticated legal philosophers miss the central distinction. So I feel that it's necessary. Here is a picture of my daughter some 10 years ago. She believed we have this Norse mythology that there are pixies and they live in the forest, and they live in attics. When we live in the city, they're somewhere in the attics. And there is this part of this mythology is that we should feed them in winter when they're cold and hungry in the attic. And my daughter had this firm belief that we were obligated to give the Christmas pixie this kind of rice pudding in December. And as you can imagine, I don't particularly agree here. At least for the last 40 years or so, I have no longer believed that we have any obligations to imaginary creatures like these Christmas pixies. However, I can make an assertion that's almost the same. I can say, as I did at the time to my wife, say, Ellen believes that my father or we are obligated to give the Christmas pixie rice pudding for Christmas. That's almost the same sentence, but it is a categorically different sentence. It's different in the sense that it changes semantically the content, it has different truth conditions. This is a sentence which is, in Ross's terminology, changed from my daughter's proposition, which is norm expressive, to mine, which is norm descriptive. Mine is furthermore, it has nothing to do with any obligations towards Christmas pixies. It's solely a question about the psychology of my daughter, whether or not she holds this belief. And this is then what in philosophy of language is called a propositional attitude report. I'm reporting on a propositional attitude of a cognizing subject, in this case my daughter, and saying something about a propositional attitude she holds towards a particular proposition. And it was first discovered by Frege in Über Sinn und Bedeutung. He pointed out the huge significance for philosophy of language of observing this distinction. When you introduce, in addition to the proposition, you introduce a subject, and you're talking about the relation, the attitudinal relation between that subject and that proposition. And basically what Ross is doing is he's just repeating that trick. If we take, he has this, it's the most boring, I think probably he found the most boring sentence in all of Danish doctrinal law, to illustrate the challenges for legal science, if it is to count as a science. He takes down a random textbook from the shelf behind him in his office, which is one by Ussing called Enkle Kontrakter, Simple Contracts, or something to that effect. And then he opens it up on a random page, and it makes a statement about something that is a fact in law, and it has the appearance of being a scientific statement, a statement that you can justify, you can hold it as a justified true belief in a scientific discipline called legal doctrine. It would have this shape of saying the acceptor is obligated to pay the bill of exchange on the due day of payment in accordance with the Danish Bill of Exchange Act. Article 28. It's an assertion that a certain obligation exists. Recalling Ross's critique of natural law and of legal positivism, he says we cannot actually, in legal science, make that kind of assertion and justify it, claim it to be a scientific statement, hold it as a scientific statement, precisely because we found that these the legal doctrinal study of law is a colossus on feet of clay, regardless whether we try to construe it on along natural law lines or legal positivist lines. However, and that's the egg of Columbus solution that he provides. He says we can change the doctrinal study of law is in a way so it keeps the legal rules as a substantive element of the assertions made in the doctrinal study of law. But it changes them to being propositional attitude reports because it introduces not individual cognizing subjects, but a group of subjects, that is judges, and their attitudinal stances towards certain legal rules. So he says that as an assertion that a certain rule is legally valid, scientifically valid, by adding that it's scientifically valid, he says, what we mean by saying this is that it's no longer a norm expressive statement, then it would just be valid, we would claim that it's true. We've seen that cannot, we cannot justify that kind of claim. But we can change the assertion we make, we can say that it's scientifically valid, meaning that judges hold this particular rule to be legally valid. By changing this assertion to that kind of assertion, Ross claims that saves legal science. If we change their meaning, then we have, as the outcome, we have a discipline that can exist on the empiricist assumptions that he subscribes to as a logical positivist or logical empiricist. One might object, and here we can perhaps recall a few of the traditional objections that could occur here. Again, reminding ourselves, is it really possible to verify empirically? Now I've sort of sorted out the semantics. If the doctrinal study of laws is to be an empirical discipline in accordance with the tenets of logical positivism or logical empiricism, it's supposed to consist of propositional attitude reports about what judges believe. Yet, on these logical empiricist grounds, can we observe what judges believe? And here we see that there is a distinction in logical empiricism. It's very often, because today we very often hear that logical empiricism or positivism was way off, very fundamentally wrong, and it's very often caricatured as a very rigid, physicalist, scientistic, strong behaviorist theory that only took into account what was strictly observable empirically. And there was a rift within the movement, the Vienna Circle movement, between a left wing and a right wing, between especially the left wing members Neurath and Carnap, who took a less strict, a less rigid route defending the empiricist assumption, saying that or watering down the verification principles so that it was possible to actually verify also propositions that were not immediately empirically verifiable if we could derive them from assertions that were verifiable. In practical terms, it means, in terms of psychology, that, for instance, my assertion about my daughter's beliefs could be called empirical in the sense that if she actually holds this belief as an empirical matter of fact, we would think that that would influence her behavior. Around Christmas, she would behave in a characteristic way. When we would go to the supermarket, she would yank my trousers and say, "Daddy, we need to buy rice because of the Christmas pigs in the attic." When we would come home, she would say we would have to make the the rice pudding. Once it was done, she would say we have to put it in the attic, and when we shut before shutting the door, she would say dinner served to the Christmas pigs, etc. All that behavior, linguistic and otherwise, is best explained empirically on the assumptions that she holds the beliefs that we, her and I, have obligations towards Christmas pixies. So that's an empirical, all that behavior empirically verifies or corroborates our assumption that she holds this belief. And in the exact same way, Ross says that the fact, the assertion that judges hold particular rules to be valid can be verified if they act accordingly when cases where the conditioning facts defined in certain legal rules are said to occur. Say if an acceptor has not paid on the due day of payment of a bill of exchange, then if a case where an acceptor has not paid, then the judge will act accordingly and order the acceptor to pay that bill of exchange, and back that order with the force of the monopoly of force. So in that sense, we can see how it's perfectly possible to have a legal science that observes legal rules, saves them as an empirical phenomenon, as something that we can talk about, yet justify our assertions not by engaging in complex internormative reasoning, trying to see whether or not it can be derived from some basic norm or some rule of recognition. We can instead directly see whether or not the people to whom we ascribe the belief actually act accordingly when in office. That's the kind of discipline that's possible, perfectly possible, and which does not overlook any of that which Hart claims it would overlook. However, and one objection which Hart had was that he said, if I make the assertion, or if Ross makes the assertion that we can save a legal science which makes statements of the kind that something is scientifically valid, some rule is scientifically valid, meaning that this is a rule held by judges, then Hart objected that cannot be the way we use valid or talk about legal validity, that the way that a judge uses the word valid when he says, in pronouncing a judgment that a certain rule is valid or not. He cannot base it, at least not if he's a member of a last instance court, he cannot base his statement on the assertion that this is what I believe. That's not, that does not work. But here we have to observe the difference between the two meanings of legal validity that Ross subscribes to, because he says that there is one ordinary language version of legal validity, which means that a rule is valid is somehow synonymous with saying it's true, it's correct, it's something that we have to abide by. And then his version of this being that it's scientifically valid, meaning that someone holds this, that is, judges hold this rule to be true, correct, valid in that sense. And Ross, by saying that precisely, does not overlook that validity has a different meaning in the mouth of a judge. He's precisely saying that I'm observing that legal judges think that this is valid, meaning they think it's true and so on. And that's precisely my assertion, is that judges think that it's true. So I cannot make that propositional attitude report. I cannot report that they hold that attitude toward that proposition if I don't, if I cannot make sense of that proposition in the first place. So that's the semantics, and it's slightly complicated and sometimes not understood, but that's the fundamental idea. One last worry that I'll just go through quickly, but it's interesting in the context, and invited by the fact, as I said, Ross, one might say, because the way I just described it, Ross makes this distinction between norm expressive and norm descriptive propositions. And one might ask whether shouldn't we read traditional legal positivism, Kelsenian style, the way he talks about ought propositions in a descriptive sense, somewhat enigmatically. Is that not exactly norm-descriptive propositions? And here I think it's useful to follow, and we know, of course, that they did this in order to precisely express their distinction or observance of the distinction between the law as it should be and law as it is. The existence of law is one thing, its merit or demerit is another, as we know from Austin. So, as Kelsen said, we use all propositions in a descriptive sense. However, and here I think that Ross's attempt at sorting out what Kelsen meant here is really helpful, because it can tell us or make us appreciate why, in spite of Ross also making a jump from norm expression to norm description, why it nevertheless is not that he's jumping into talking about all propositions in the descriptive sense in the way Kelsen does. He makes this distinction, Ross, between what he calls detached and committed normative statements, and you're probably familiar with this example of the Jew and the Catholic talking about the Catholic being the expert on rabbinical law and the Jew just being a normal lay Jew observing the fundamental tenets of rabbinical law. And Ross says, imagine an orthodox but relatively ill-informed Jew who asks the advice of his friend who is Catholic but an expert in rabbinical law. What should I do, he asks, clearly meaning what should I do according to my religion, not yours. The friend tells him to do so and so. So here we can see that apparently the Catholic is making a normative statement. However, and that's precisely what Ross wishes to emphasize, he's making what we would say in Ross's terminology is still a norm expressive statement. He's expressing what a certain person should or should not do, what he's obligated to do or not. As opposed to the way I'm talking about my daughter, the way Ross is talking about the Supreme Court judge that I had on the screen before. The distinction that Ross is making is one between, he says that there is, that it's a pragmatic distinction. The Catholic is saying what he should do, sort of bracketing his own fundamental normative stance and saying what you should do from the point of view of someone who subscribes to the fundamental assumptions of rabbinical law. So it's an old proposition, but it's said without its normal normative force. So the distinction between the two sentences, had it been said by a rabbi compared to a Catholic who's expert in rabbinical law, is one of pragmatics, not of semantics. It's a question of being said with a different intention behind, but the meaning is the same. However, as I said, the distinction between norm-expressive and norm-descriptive statements in Ross's terms is the way he uses this distinction is one of semantics. The two statements mean something fundamentally different. One is immediately expressing that a certain norm is valid, that we are obligated to act in a certain way. The other is a propositional attitude report that someone holds this to be the case. So in this sense, yes, as I said, the difference between detached and committed normative statements is merely pragmatic. It's not semantic. So in that sense, we can sort of and here we have to come along with me for a while. If we return to the assertion that the acceptor is obligated to pay the bill of exchange on the due day of payment, then if you're a natural lawyer, you would sort of subscribe to this assertion, if by the way you mean that it can be derived correctly, ultimately be in accordance with the fundamental assumptions about justice that you're making, etc., in the given jurisdiction that you're talking about, then, and this is Finnish in his younger days, then you would be able to make that kind of assertion without any problems and perfectly in the same way that the Danish Supreme Court judge is making it. The legal positivists, whom Ross and I use his terminology precisely to see how he makes a distinction between himself as a realist and the idealists who are, whom he says are the, well, in Danish it's called material idealism, but it's actually substantive idealism. It's an idealism that also adds content to what it is that should be the content of the rules that can exist in a given as valid in a given jurisdiction. And then formal idealism being the legal positivists, who says that the merit or demerit is another question. Its existence is all that matters. And we can see that we can distinguish between the different kinds of statements in the following way. See, we have everything that's said in here is norm expressive. However, the judge and the natural lawyers, they are making norm expressive statements that are committed. So they subscribe to and believe in the fundamental justness of the foundational assumptions on the basis of which this specific doctrinal statement can be asserted. Then we have also a norm-expressive but detached assertion being made by the legal positivists, who say that we're not saying it in the fundamental normative sense with the normative import that it normally carries, that we are obligated to do this, or that it's merely a legal fact. And then we have, so these are both norm-expressive or normative in the traditional sense, and then we have a norm-descriptive assertion being made. And this shows also how we could, in theory, expand. Ross primarily talks about and says that we can have a legal discipline, a scientific legal discipline that can honor his fundamental assumptions about logical empiricist assumptions about what it takes for something to be a legal science. He says that it's primarily a discipline about judges' beliefs about valid law, but we can expand it actually and say that it's an empirical, a sociological study of all groups, legal scholars, for instance, what do they generally take to be valid law? What do working lawyers take to be valid law? What do lay people in the street? We can have all sorts of targeted sociological studies of what certain groups of people think is a valid law in a particular field. So that's sort of a way of sketching out the fundamental theory, or making clear the fundamental assumptions of Ross's theory, the way he avoids the traditional challenges that are being launched against it, and the way in which, in particular, he manages to be distinct from the two kinds of idealism, and especially in what sense we can say that the traditional contenders are in reality on the same side of a very interesting and important divide in legal philosophy that is not always granted the attention I think it deserves. I think I'll end here. Apologies for going a bit over, it was a bit late, right? So I'll be delighted to hear your comments.
Thanks very much, Jakob. Before we go to the Q&A, we're just going to have some comments from the statement.
There's a lot here. Thank you for this very interesting talk. So the way I thought I would do it is I would try to follow the structure of your talk, but there were a lot of other points that we could be talking about. And once you start talking about it, I think we always end up in the foundation of the verification principle and so on. And this is a complex topic in the sense that Ross wrote something, Hart criticized them, you and others have then defended Ross against Hart, and I now see it as my role here to be the advocatus diaboli, and then try to defend Hart against your defense of Ross, of the criticism of Hart.
Wonderfully complimented.
So the first part would be around that sentence that Hart has in the book of Introduction to Essays on Jurisprudence and Philosophy, where he says, the failure of Ross and the legal realist is that they remark and explain the crucial difference between rule-governed behavior and reducing human behavior into regularities and prediction. And so the first kind of part of that sentence would be, which you said here, Ross overlooked the internal, and you say, no, he didn't do that. And it seems rather obvious that he didn't do that. So one might wonder, was this firstly really Hart's criticism? Was he really just making that crude point? Maybe people took him to making that point, but maybe he didn't. And you actually mark in your own writings that he noted that Ross had this internal perspective. So the first kind of question would be a clarifying one. Do you take Hart to be making a cruder point, that he overlooked it, or are you defending it because people are taking Hart to have made that point?
In that sense, it's a very good question because precisely because I think my starting point is that as a matter of history of ideas, intellectual history, Hart's writings have had an adverse effect on the reception of Ross's work. Exactly what Hart meant, exactly what parts of his writings address Ross's work in particular, and what parts address more broadly. Someone called the realists, sometimes even the command theory or Austin, is somewhat unclear. I'm trying, at least as pedagogically as I can in the introduction, to sort out, idealize objections that I think we can have read from Hart's work, or people can think that have been valid points made by Hart against Ross, and I've seen them at least reproduced as such elsewhere. I have a longer article in which I am a bit more sort of careful in sorting out exactly, or trying, because there is not much to go by on trying to figure out what Hart exactly meant about Ross. He has a few, for instance, in the introduction to the concept of law, he actually allows he talks about a whole school of theory in Scandinavia, which he says has an answer to the crude behaviorist analysis. So he actually there, it seems that he ascribes a more sophisticated view to the Scandinavians rather than himself adopting a view that has this character against the Scandinavians as someone who proposes this behaviorist approach. So yeah, the short answer is that no, it's not necessarily Hart's own critique, all of it, but it's what people have read in Hart's work, and sometimes also it's Hart's own fault, I think, that he was not very careful in saying who he was actually talking about when he was criticizing this position.
So the remaining points in question mainly go in that what could have been Hart's point,
Yes.
or if you're a Hartian because you don't really care about history, what could the Hartian respond to your responses, and so on.
Yes.
And the way I see it is that the main worry that is underlying this is that Ross is not giving an adequate account of rule-governed behavior, the concept of validity that actually matters, because he's focusing on feelings and predictions. And so if I kind of break this main worry into more smaller points, is that if we keep under what did Ross overlook, well, Hart might have said something, well, he had the internal, but he didn't have the internal aspects of rules. So by analyzing these rules in the terms of patterns of action and then psychological experiences of being socially bound, you're actually missing something important internally about the rules as such. Would that be something that you would?
Yes, and that is something I address, and I actually sort of in the longer paper I mentioned, I sort of move from what has been taken to me to try to, as charitably as I can, interpret and develop as strongly as I can his objections, and it's precisely that ends very much along those lines. The problem with that objection is that I don't see Hart's analysis of the internal aspect. If you really go through Ross's writings and compare them to Hart's writings, I don't see Hart being any more sophisticated, faithful, nuanced in his portrayal of sort of the phenomenology of the internal aspect. Precisely because Ross's analysis is not merely that it's one big blur of feelings, sort of just amorphously judges feel attached to something, feels sort of, and there lingers something along an emotivist analysis of semantics, sort of the boo hooray theory. So it's just sort of one big amorphous boo or hooray feeling from judges towards something they have to do. And actually Ross has a very rich semantics for normative language. It's no coincidence that in 1968 he wrote Directives and Norms. It's one of the most sophisticated, and especially for the time, an extremely sophisticated work in deontic logic. If he literally thought that normative language, norm-expressive language, was just one big meaningless blurb, amorphous, and you could just sort of have strong feelings about it, then he wouldn't be able to write that logic. He can on the and if you read, and actually Hart recognizes that in 1959, he says that a lot of lawyers would be better off from reading Ross's very strong pages on legal method, on the on legal interpretation, and on the sources of law, and especially legal interpretation, because Ross has no problem exactly. I mean, I can fully appreciate, to use my example with my daughter, all the subtle nuances about the mythology of the Norse mythology, exactly who perhaps fractions think that, oh no, not only on equal years would we have obligations toward Christmas pixies or whatnot, and how exactly they would hierarchize one obligation compared to another, etc. I could account for all that without any problem if I do it in a norm-descriptive way where I ascribe those beliefs to my daughter. And Ross can, in the same way, actually, it's not a problem for him to accept that judges hold the kinds of beliefs and have the kinds of critical reflective attitude that the heart thinks they do, as long as he maintains his distance of putting it all within the speech bubble and ascribing the belief in all of that to a certain group of people, that is judges. Then you can have all the so the phenomenology, the semantics can be perfectly as nuanced as Hart ever was, and I think Ross is even more nuanced, but we can discuss that. The key difference is the epistemological one that Ross says, I do not myself have to hypothetically jump in, adopt, subscribe to the rule of recognition in order for me to be able to do all of this. I can stand on the outside and look at these people and ascribe all these beliefs to them, depending on whether or not they act in accordance with what I ascribe to them. Does that answer the concern?
I guess he would say that you're still missing that it needs to be a standard, that you use that standard in certain ways, and how it is used from the internal perspective is very illuminating, whereas in the pages that we have from Ross, he's not talking about that aspect of the rule-governed behavior. So I'm not objecting to that Ross cannot incorporate it, but he doesn't in these pages do it. He says, here's a pattern of social action. Here are feelings of being bound by this pattern, but it doesn't give you then what is this pattern as opposed to something else, like the standard, what makes it a norm, or as opposed to some other psychological belief, or do you know what I mean? He doesn't really tell me what makes this norm, and this belief here is not a norm. Or how do the people that experience these things experience norms, the rules, differently from the other things that they experience?
Do you have the word, what's the word in English? Cognizance? There is a word, right? My impression is that Ross clearly thinks that, and in that sense, what you're saying here, that Hart allows us to observe is sort of the epistemic character of the field. The fact that these are beliefs, not really feelings, that they believe that they hold certain things to be true and certain or valid, and certain things to be incorrect, invalid, etc. And Ross can do exactly the same. The thing he has no problem. In fact, he thinks that explains a lot of their behavior, the discussions between. He says clearly these people do believe that certain assumptions about law are correct, certain assumptions are incorrect. We have a sort of a very rudimentary, but in his theory there is a genealogy of how did judges generally come to hold beliefs about valid law as something that they can make correct statements about, etc. He's just saying that they are just wrong about when they think that they can actually justify their assertions, and we cannot have a scientific discipline that makes those kinds of assertions. He's not saying that they don't think they have that kind of, that it's knowledge that they're conveying when they're making assertions, that they are claiming that certain uses of language are more central and aligned with the standard and others less so, and so on.
So if I understand, so my problem is I think I understand what Ross is saying, so I'm not really good at criticizing him. So the second part would be okay, so he didn't overlook something, but he misconstrued the internal one, he made it was inaccurate in some way. And so how is it inaccurate? And that follows directly from what we were talking about. And what I understood you to be saying, at least in some places, is that that feeling of being bound is a necessary feature of accepting a rule from an internal perspective. Whereas Hart is very explicit that yes, this feeling can be there, but it's not a necessary feature. So that is one, is it a necessary feature or not? And then second is, okay, be it necessary or not necessary, is it characteristic? And the way I would read Hart is that he is saying, well, being bound is not the characteristic feature of a given rule, but that critical reflective attitude. So that is the thing that is more illuminating. So Hart indicates, yes, you can do something like Ross is doing, but why would you want to do it when this is more illuminating for the kind of thing that we're trying to explain? And maybe you can also comment on whether Alf Ross thinks that that feeling of being bound is a necessary feature, or whether it just tends to be there generally.
The thing is, I've written about this in detail, now it's far away, but which it shouldn't be today. Ross's primary idea when he speaks about feelings of being bound is less literally binding in the way Hart seems to be interpreting it. I mean, it's getting back to what I said before, a cognizance. If you think that something is correct, that there is an obligation to do this or that, then if you really assert that, then it's what it implies is merely that there is a relation of implication from truly holding that belief, and then there is how do you say, performative inconsistency in saying that you subscribe to a certain tenet, that I believe that something is the case, and then act in every way in contradiction with what we would think that assumption would imply. That's what we often object to the die-hard skeptic who says that there are no chairs sitting comfortably in a chair. There seems to be in their actions, behavior, an assumption of something that they're expressly saying they don't believe in. And it's difficult to see exactly in what sense you can identify the critical reflective attitude as a distinct aspect. What makes rule-governed behavior distinct, and at the same time say that you're completely free. That's precisely the kind of bindingness that Ross is also talking about. That people are presenting something and can be exposed to criticism, etc. So it's precisely not this sort of binary, either you're sort of blindly bound or you're not bound. It's pretty much the same, and I will have to check up on the
Does the English language help here when it distinguishes between ought, must, shall, and a number of other?
Yes, definitely. It's not a must, for instance, sort of involuntarily. But of course, there is a difference in the sense that Ross wishes to express a kind of meta-ethical skepticism. He thinks that there is an irrationalism to the subscription of the judges. They are wrong when they hold something to be the case. And in that sense, by stressing the feeling aspect, he brings that out. But I don't think, at the same time, if we're sort of really picking the phenomenological analysis of the what is the attitude that they hold toward the given proposition, I don't think that there is a very deep difference. The difference is rather one of Ross being a kind of error theorist in the Mackey sense. I don't know if that rings a bell in this context. The idea that Mackie says he's precisely not a non-cognitivist. He doesn't say that assertions about ethical assertions or value assertions cannot be true or false. He says that they carry the import of being true or false. Actually, the thing, and he accepts, as a skeptic, he accepts the burden of proof, saying it seems to be widely held, the belief that there are truths in ethics, and we can say Hart observes that it is the case in law, and the others does too. And he says, so I accept the burden of proof of explaining why it has come about that so many people hold these epistemic attitudes to this particular kind of beliefs, yet being in the wrong. We explain by studying different kinds of patterns of objectification, etc., how this has occurred, and that is Ross's idea, basically, that they all think that they know what the law is and what it implies, what obligations exist, but they are just wrong. We can explain how that belief occurred among all these people.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to jump ahead of some of the questions and take the last two together. So you had that objection of Hart where he says, this is not the concept of validity in the mouth of the judge, neither when he is talking about his own or other judge's behavior. He's not predicting what they are going to do. And indeed, you're going to be able to make prediction on the basis of the thing that they think is valid. And your response to that is exactly, there are two different concepts of validity. Is that, juridical validity and scientific validity. And then Ross is talking about the separate things, and Hart conflates them. Now, okay, let's assume that we could just accept that. Then could a Hartian then say, fine, and I recognize that you can do this, but all this talk about scientific validity, is that illuminating? Why should we focus on this concept of validity? Is it better than the concept that Hart is focusing on? Do we really need this concept of validity? A lot of these theories that you mentioned, they don't have it, and people haven't thought, well, they're missing something. And then does Alf Ross need an explanation of that juridical validity that is adequate? I do recognize that later in the book and in a different article he has that. So that's kind of one, is it illuminating? And then the second one would be because you mentioned these different perspectives. So I'm not sure if I understood you correctly, but the way I understood you was that you were saying that Hart was saying that you needed the internal point of view to recognize the rule recognition. Whereas the way I read Hart is that he is doing a very similar thing as Ross. So he's saying there are different kinds of external statements. One is that you can focus on the regularities, which is kind of like with behaviorism. The other one is you can try to understand it the way the participants understand it for them. So he's using the external point of view with an internal aspects of rules, whereas Ross is using the norm-descriptive point of view with his introspective method. And that seems to me to be a very similar move. And just a note here, so Hart doesn't say that rule recognition is valid or invalid, it is just a fact that it exists, and you assert that fact from the external point of view, not the internal point of view. So I was wondering, this kind of principle distinction that you're drawing here, does it hold true for Hart? Because I wonder, a Hartian might say, actually when you use that external point of view, even with the internal aspect, why wouldn't that hold true to the verification principle and so on? Did that make sense? It would be better.
I think so. Perhaps right at the end you may have lost me, but then let's see. Starting with your second question, if I may. I'd say, in a sense, the way Hart addresses the rule of recognition is the same way Ross addresses both primary and secondary rules. And that's the key difference. the criterion for validity of any given primary rule in Hart's theory, unless I misunderstood him fundamentally, is not whether or not people hold them to be valid. So when a traditional doctrinal scholar, according to Hart, is making an assertion that a given rule is valid, like that one, not the rule of recognition, any other primary rule, then he's making a detached norm-expressive statement in the way I just said. And he identifies whether it's valid or not in the exact same way as a Kelsenian would by engaging in internormative reasoning, trying to derive it from the rule of recognition. So a lot of what you said is basically what Hart says about the rule of recognition. And that he seems to think somehow you identify whether it's valid or not, somewhat on the basis of much the same as Ross does with any specific given primary rule, right? But this means that if we're looking at law faculties around the world, then hardly any working professor in law in any specific area are working on what the rule of recognition is. It's only in jurisprudence. The rest are doing consumer law or whatnot and making that kind of assertions. And they're then engaging, their criterion verification principle, or the way they verify an assertion is doctrinal. In Danish we would say dogmatic. It's doctrine. They try to see whether or not it follows from certain other norms, etc., which we may somewhere at the end of the whole thing or think are in accordance with the rule of recognition. Unless perhaps we have a rule of recognition, which I don't think Hart really meant, which is that any rule is valid which judges currently hold to be valid. I don't think that was his position, but maybe he could.
I can just jump in on that because it also makes it really hard to compare Hart and Ross, because Hart isn't focusing on what legal science proper is.
No,
so
that brings me to the second.
So that makes it really hard to know whether he would indeed say that legal scientists should use the internal perspective. You could have a legal scientist that would use the external perspective and say, the people here in England, they think this is a rule on consumer law and so on. So that is one thing. And then the second thing is, now we have legal science proper in the Ross sense, and then I took it to be that most legal professors doing doctrinal studies are doing the more expressive internal statements. So they are not doing what Ross is saying is legal science. So should legal science make statements about what they are doing when they are making statements about the law, or what if a judge would adopt the scientific point of view of him? Would legal science have to make a norm descriptive statement about his attempt to make a norm descriptive statement? But you don't have to answer that. I know.
Well, the last are sort of. We can take it at a sort of. I don't know. What we're trying to find out is not. I don't know what legal science would have to do in many. There's a lot of things it doesn't have to do with. But the question is it possible to have a legal science? That's Ross's fundamental problem, and that's exactly returning to your first question in this final round. Whether, in a sense, is it too high a price that he's paying in order to save legal science? It's, as I said, the egg of Columbus is, I think, a useful metaphor precisely because the kind of egg that survives doesn't look a lot like the egg that we put in there. And it's, of course, a different legal science. It's kind of radical that we end up with a science that actually doesn't tell us objectively whether or not a given rule, an obligation that is stated in a given rule is objectively valid or not, that we have an obligation or not as legal subjects. But from Ross's point of view, that's precisely, if you really, I sometimes quote, Charles Sanders Peirce has this quote where he says, "It's not a sin to have no taste for philosophy." I think in this sense, Hart didn't have a taste for philosophy. He didn't, in terms of epistemology, he couldn't care less. He had no bone in his body that worried about the possibility conditions of knowledge. he was sort of, that was precisely, he was the ordinary language reaction to the logical positivists being frantically obsessed with that question. So they were like, oh, just letting go of all of that. As Aquinas says one place, he didn't know of heart, but he said about Wittgenstein and his followers, mainly at Oxford, found a residual vocation in therapy and curing philosophers of the idea that there were epistemological problems. There is no epistemological problems according to Hart, so we can just run around and sort of describe a bit what people are doing, and that's more or less fine. And in that sense, of course, we can also, there is no reason why we should draw any drastic inferences, because we haven't really asked the deep question whether or not science is possible. Ross, in a sense, is demonstrating that he means this challenge seriously, that if you engage with epistemology, worrying, is it science or isn't it, then it might end up being the case that we have to answer that question in the negative and not in the affirmative. Like Descartes, when he said, I've been so fundamentally shaken by the fact that I've erred so many times. Could it be that I know nothing? Luckily, he ends up, and then he knows a lot at the end of the 6 meditations. But if you really care about epistemology, then at least in theory it's possible. And Ross says, unfortunately, it ends up being impossible to actually justify this institution that we see so many people engaged in, and then we have to, at least there is a deep philosophical problem. What do we do in response to this? And he claims that it should be changed to a different kind of discipline. And that's a deep Methodenstreit, as I said at the beginning. That's the faculty that's raging at my the discussion that is raging at my faculty and many faculties in law generally, and going back to the empirical term, that precisely Armstrong is lamenting. You're studying something different. What about what European law is saying? You're studying empirical phenomena, doing interesting political science about institutions, but you're not telling us anything about the law. And the empirical scientists reply, if they're Russians, it would be wonderful. It would also be nice to have alchemy. A lot of disciplines would be nice to have if they delivered on their promise. And he's sort of, in that sense, a philosopher that takes his problem seriously. And then I'm not necessarily, in many ways I'm not. I'm sort of just trying to say, okay, if we really subscribe to these assumptions or take the question seriously, and I don't think it's just an archaic thing. I think it's all around us in these battles between approaches to law and the empirical approaches. You see this underlying, you see people precisely making inroads, claiming some kind of replacement strategy towards law, taking it over from the doctrinalists. And you see external research funding bodies that actually fund empirical work instead of doctrinal work very often, precisely because when they sit in these bodies, you have people who have been taught in a different methodology, where they say, that science, that legal doctrine thing, where you adopt something unique that only you guys know, which is called the doctrinal method, that we cannot.
And this brings us to the foundational question, because when Hart takes the Armstrong point of view, which says the method of empirical science is the wrong method to do it.
Yes.
But I think we should open up to Q&A.
Thank you.